I use every tool. I will use, because one cinematographer will live or die by their spectra color, or excuse me, lighting meter, reflective meter. And another one wants to look at the monitor, doesn't even want to see a waveform, just wants to look at the monitor and say, okay, that looks good. Others are, all right, here's what my meter's saying, here's what it looks like on there, here's what it looks like on the waveform. All right, those all kind of add up, or, well, it's not adding up on my meter, or maybe it looks darker on the monitor, but your waveform looks good, right? Or, you know, because some can interpolate, and there's also multiple modes you can be in, RGB, parade versus a luminance mode, something like that, just how you see the image, or how you assess the tools. But
that I have a long history of exposure, being a commercial photographer for 30 years. So I can look at scopes, and I can look at a scene, and I can tell you, you know, you're a half stop under over, a third stop under over, and maybe you can address that and make the correction. On some projects, I even pull iris, which is if I see that the next scene is a little over, I can, you know, scale that down by stopping down, and vice versa. If it's a little under, I can open up a bit. So there are times where I do that for a DP.
On some television shows, I've set the exposure on 5 cameras every day for 10 months, and the DP never even touches the exposure, because he relies on me to do that, and he can go fight other battles in the lighting department or do something like that. And then other DPs will dictate, okay, this whole commercial will be shot at a T4. I want everything to be at this color balance. You know, you keep a critical eye on the focus, and any other problems that we might have in the frame, address those, bring them to our attention, and he'll be right there with me the whole time.
I use, for judging exposure, I really use the waveform monitor, the image on the monitor, and what we're shooting. So knowing what we're shooting, is it a car with lots of specular highlights? Is it a low-key interior scene? You know, where does this scene want to be? You know, and where does the DP want this scene to be? So, and still allowing himself a little bit of room to adjust in post.
Great about the exposure on the Red is they give you all the tools right then and there. Even though what's coming out of it isn't accurate, 100% accurate, it is, the tools that they give you are very accurate. So if I will use the goalposts that are the left and you know, if you're looking at a histogram, obviously one's your shadows, your midtones, your highlights, and the goalposts are on the either end of it, with one being you know, your blacks being crushed, one being your highlights being blown, if you will. No more detail, and it goes both ways. Black, you know, black detail versus white detail. The stoplights are fantastic. What's important with the use with the stoplights is that they're seeing the whole image globally. So if you have one light that is pure white, all right, and the rest of your other image is normal exposure to black, those stoplights may still hit. And you're not saying, wow, that whole image, oh my God, we're blown. And then you're now judging based off the entire global image, when you could do something simple as putting your hand in front of the camera and covering that one spot of the exposure, or the meat of it, if you look at it in thirds or zones, if you're an Ansel Adams person. You can look at each one of the zones, and if you just kind of say, okay, now if I black this part of the zone of exposure on this image, oh, look at all my stoplights go out, and actually, oh wow, I'm actually a little bit underexposed. So now you're making a decision of where do you want to, oh, well, you know, we want to bring the actors' faces. Ultimately, faces are probably the most important thing. to background and foreground. But I would say, oh, well, maybe that's ideal. And that's when you look at your histogram. That's maybe on red, it's a little bit tough on your waveform, but it can be used. I have used it before as like a, ultimate back end. I couldn't look at the actual output of the camera at the time because the director wanted to see something without the tools that the red provides. Actually, and you can't always be at the camera, at the monitor, at the LCD or whatever it may be. I totally recommend the 9-inch LCDs. They're great to see things nice and LCDs. They're great.
When you're doing on-set exposures, there are two factors that come in. One of which is what looks good to your eye, number one, and number two is what your piece of test equipment says. Your test equipment offers the accurate view of really the signal management and exactly where your exposure areas are. But sometimes that doesn't always factor in because your eye is saying, I like it to be a little hotter or I'd like it to be a little bit darker. And that's really a preference of choice. So I collaborate with the DPs on broadcast standards, and basically that's where I maintain it. It has to be within a broadcast standard or broadcast specs. So the blacks aren't too clipped and the whites aren't too clipped, and that the gray area is exactly where it should be, the flesh tones are where they should be. And for the most part, there may be an adjustment in post either way, up or down, but that again is a preference of choice. But for the most part, on-set accuracy with signal management is critical. I handle communication with the first assistant, the focus puller. He'll set exposure for me. I usually don't have control. On a single camera television, I do not have control of the exposures most of the time. Sometimes I have Preston units that are wireless, and I can set the exposures. The last show I did, I had Preston units for both cameras, so I could set the exposure. Typically, if I don't have that, I'll very diplomatically over the radio talk to the focus puller about. I've run into DPs where exposure is everything, and they have to maintain it. Others trust me to set the exposures and know it's there, and maybe come back to me on the radio, how does that look? And I have it on the scope, so I know what it is, and I know what latitude I have. Even in correctability, if he wanted it under or over, I still know that he has the ability to do that. He has the ability to.
The first approach that I start with is I would say the lens. Lens is the first thing. What kind of lenses are we using? The second will be the sensor, what that sensor is capable of, whether it's a red sensor or an Alexa sensor or f55 sensor or 65 or Phantom for that matter. What is that sensor capable of? And then I take what that dynamic range will be, and I will factor in the creative intent of what the cinematographer does. The cinematographer says, I want everything to be rich blacks, rich, natural, contrasty blacks. I want it all to be there. Then I've just basically thrown perfect exposure, nominal exposure out the window because I've said, okay, that's a look. We're going for that look. And then I just try to thread the needle, if you will, in the blacks or underexposure, like what is acceptable underexposure, because there's a lot of cinematographers that like to do that. Once if we're trying to get a good, solid, I would say normal looking exposure, after I've assessed what sensor we have, then I usually typically work with a leader waveform. I have my monitors, whether it be LCD or OLED, which is what I'm using more and more. And then I'll see what I'm looking at. All my monitors are calibrated to 709 spec or a P3 spec. I haven't really had to do much with ACES, but that shouldn't matter much. And I really just like to look at what's there in front of us and assess that. The cinematographer's meter is very important too. But if you're looking at a log created image, like red log or log C, then actually looking at the log, we'll be able to set a more accurate exposure if your theory of your look is protect the highlights or protect the lowlights, because that happens sometimes as well. Obviously filter, that kind of the filter factor, I guess. That's how I generally approach. I mean, I'll look at what skin tone will be on a waveform, and I use my vector scope a lot as well. And then in Red's case, for example, you have a histogram that they like to use. So in combination with all of those tools, I like to use all of them, and that helps me judge what we're going to be ultimately in terms of exposure. But if we're just talking like we're doing an exposure test, like we're doing a technical exposure test, then I will always have a chart. Typically, I mean, the cinematographer and I usually, I'll have a chart. He may expose to that chart. We'll use false color if we need to. We'll use the waveform if what's coming out of the camera is accurate, because that's a whole nother deal. Is if what's coming out of the camera is accurate or can be accurately judged, then what you see is what you get, and you can certainly judge it. But if what's coming out of it varies so extremely between camera to camera to camera to camera, then you have to use the other tools that are available to you. Sometimes you use what you can to do it. Sometimes I'll pull it into the computer and judge exposure that way. Other times I will actually just be looking solely at my monitor and my waveform. And there's a couple other available functions within the monitors now. Multiple cameras obviously are really important in maintaining exposure for all of those. Different viewing angles produce different exposures. I may have one camera that's shooting right down the pipe, one that's 45 degrees off, another one that's 180 degrees from the A camera, if you will, getting a totally separate, different shot, but I'm required, because I see all three images, in order to match those to the best of my ability at the time. Sometimes you're screwed. It doesn't matter. You have no time. They won't give you time. And if you bring up anything, you're being a nuisance. So I like to tread lightly if I can. And other DPs, they don't want me to like Bob Richardson doesn't want me to talk to him about exposure or lighting or anything. Nothing. He just wants to see an image on the monitor that he likes. And he'll tell you what he likes. You can't say, well, if your light did this. No. It's sit there, you listen, you color, you do what he tells you, what he wants. Others want me to do everything. In terms of exposure, they want me to set that. We've had a conversation. I'm too busy, managing the camera or dealing with the director or actors or whatever it may be. It's all just how do you like to work? What's the most efficient way for you to work? Because some are wireless, some are wired. They want you to be wired.
But exposure is the main thing for digital. Keeping my highlights well maintained and not crushing my shadows. I want to be able to have a flexible negative. That means I can go in and color correct it. I can put some more bottom on it, crush the blacks. I don't want them already crushed at all. I want to maintain some kind of information in my highlights. It's very important. And if I want to blow that out artificially in a color correction, that's fine too. But I want to have it there just in case I don't. Things that matter are color temperature with compressed video cameras. Like if you're shooting with any DSLR, I try to get the color temperature spot on neutral from the word go. So if you're shooting in daylight, don't have your color temperature setting at 3200. Yeah, you can correct it out, but by correcting it, you're going to do so much damage to that file. It's going to, and if you're doing kind of VFX or any kind of other post-processing to that image, as it keeps going through each one of those processes, the image quality gets less and less and less. So exposure, try to keep your exposure right on the money, try to keep your color temp. Now I work with a color temperature meter. I have a Sekonic C500. It's a brilliant digital color temp meter. I can go in, take a color temperature reader, set it in that camera, and now my skin tones are very neutral. Now if I want to enhance them in a color correction, they can be enhanced, but I'm not correcting. I'm just enhancing. Which is, I'm not tearing that digital file or stretching it. And every time you stretch it, you go from, if you ever look at a histogram, before you touch a file, it's all together with, peaks and small little valleys. But after you touch it, it starts to do this. And each one of these little gaps between my fingers is lost data that you never get back. And you have to do that in order to fix the file. It's just the natural process. It's the con of the pro.